His Excellency the President.
The Paris Climate Agreement has taken a step closer to coming into force after 31 more countries formally signed up to it at the UN. The deal requires ratification by a minimum of 55 countries. 60 have done so, but together they only represent 47.5% of global emissions, falling short of the deal's 55% target.
We have crossed one of the two thresholds, the 55 countries, so it's well over. Now let us work harder to get all the 7.5% greenhouse gas emissions added more.
Last December in Paris, 195 countries submitted promises to curb their greenhouse gas emissions in order to limit the global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It has an aspiration of keeping it to 1.5 degrees. With record-breaking heat levels being recorded across the globe, experts say the deal can't come into effect soon enough. Prolonged droughts and rising sea levels are already threatening sections of the world's population.
60 countries, accounting for nearly 48% of greenhouse gas emissions, had joined the agreement by mid-morning in New York on Wednesday, meeting one of two thresholds for the Paris Agreement to enter into force. That satisfied the requirement that at least 55 countries sign on. But the second threshold requires those signatories to represent 55% of global emissions, and they fall a little short. New signatories representing 7.5% of global emissions are still needed. But Secretary General Ban Ki-moon says the progress made in the span of just 9 months is remarkable.
What once seemed impossible is now inevitable. I'm confident that by the time I leave office, the Paris Agreement will have entered into force.
The Paris Agreement marks a pivotal step in the long march to address climate change, with China and the U.S. leading the charge.
They're the world's two largest greenhouse gas emitters. And so when they joined the deal earlier this month, that was intended to provide momentum for other countries to also sign on. Both of these countries have committed themselves to having the deal up and running by the end of this year.
But with a lot of the terms based on broad principle, the key challenge now, climate experts say, is to set guiding rules.
I think a lot of these rules have to be in place so that it's very clear and very transparent that when a country submits a nationally determined contribution, which is essentially their plan for greenhouse gas emissions, that it meets certain standards that everyone accepts and that everyone can see and that everyone can judge for themselves what progress is made 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, so that these plans can become more ambitious over time, which is the key aspect of this agreement.
Critics say what's on paper isn't enough to limit the average global temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, much less the 1.5-degree best-case goal outlined in the agreement. Supporters say the Paris Agreement sets out a clear path for what nations need to accomplish this year, next year, and over the next decade. But there are still details to iron out, like how to finance projects to lower emissions and how to support developing countries in their efforts. But if nations are committed to ratification, climate change experts say we could see very aggressive carbon reduction over the long term. Mimi Chahman, CCTV, New York.
Major topic at the UN. Climate change. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is hoping to have the Paris climate change fully ratified before his term ends this year. For more on climate change, we're joined by Paul Bledsoe. He's an expert on energy and the former director of communications of the White House Climate Change Task Force under the Clinton administration. Paul, welcome.
Hi, Asya.
Let's talk about what happened at UN in New York. A lot of numbers going around, a lot of progress. Can you kind of walk us through what happened?
A remarkable outpouring of support for the Paris Agreement. When it was agreed to last December, the thought was that it would take effect maybe 2018, 2019. It's almost certainly going to enter into force this year.
But has
less than a year before
on?
It's negotiated. The agreement requires 55 countries. We've passed that mark. We now have over 60. and 55% of emissions. We're at about 48% of emissions. We expect to get the remaining 7% in the next month or two. It could be done in one fell swoop, for example, if the European Union were to approve it.
Are they the sole holdout here, the European Union?
No, it's just, it takes governments time to do these things practically in their legislatures, but the truth is it's going to go into effect this year, which is really stunning. No one expected it, and I think it's for two reasons. The first is climate change impacts around the world are beginning to have huge economic costs. The U.S. government released a study last week that the Louisiana floods that left 60,000 homes destroyed or damaged were made 50% more likely because of climate change. These are the kind of numbers that are getting governments' attentions. The other thing, I think, is that the possible prospect of a Donald Trump presidency is frightening to many world leaders, given what he said, calling climate change a hoax and even a Chinese conspiracy. So I believe there's an effort to get this done while Obama and Ban Ki-moon are in office.
You mentioned the flooding in Louisiana. There have been devastating floods in China.
Yes.
China has led the effort in this process. How is China's own effort here, Paul? Can it be a model for other countries? Countries like India, perhaps?
I'm headed to India on Sunday to talk just about this kind of thing. Yes, China has been an incredible leader in the last 2 years on climate change. In fact, what galvanized the whole entry into force process was an agreement between President Xi and President Modi, both to approve the treaty. And that, in and of itself, gave us 40% of the emissions we needed. Now China and other major economies need to make investments in less developed nations, including India, to give them the infrastructure to modernize while reducing emissions. Let me give you an example. India's cooling sector, air conditioning sector, is due to grow 400% in the next 15 years. If we do that with the most efficient technologies, Indian consumers will save $120 billion over that period and will avoid warming of 0.5 degrees centigrade. These are huge numbers, huge economic and climate change opportunities that the world's major economies have to grab.
So why has India seemingly been a little slow in this process, certainly not as speedy as China?
India is at an earlier point in development. Prime Minister Modi is very focused on poverty alleviation. We still have more than 300 million Indians who live in dire poverty, who have no access to electricity. And so their development agenda is important. However, Prime Minister Modi has a big opportunity coming up. This is a separate negotiation called the Montreal Protocol about HFCs, which are chemicals used as coolants in refrigeration. These are super greenhouse gases that warm thousands of times more than CO2. If we can phase out these chemicals, we will reduce warming by a full 0.5 degree Celsius. So taken together, phasing out HFCs and energy efficiency can cut warming a full degree Celsius in this century. India has an opportunity to do that, and I'm going to be discussing that next week with the government and others.
And very quickly, the next session is in November in Morocco. Is that accurate?
That's the next UN session, but I think that the eyes should be on the Kigali, Rwanda talks on HFCs. That's October 10th through 14th.
Got it. Paul Bledsoe, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
India has announced it will ratify the Paris Agreement on climate change on October the 2nd. Prime Minister Narendra Modi says the ratification date is the same day the leader of the Indian independence movement, Mahatma Gandhi, was born. The United Nations says that 60 countries accounting for around 48% of global gas emissions have already joined the agreement. The Paris Agreement urges all countries involved to monitor and prevent the rapid effects of climate change and requires governments to initiate national plans to reduce gas emissions. India accounts for around 4.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions in the world.
Environment ministers from across the EU have agreed to ratify a landmark UN climate accord. The agreement to cut greenhouse gas emissions was struck in Paris in December. It needs at least 55 countries representing at least 55% of emissions to ratify it before the pact can enter into force. The US and China have already done so. The EU's move means it will likely enter into force by the end of the year.
our reputation was on the line, because remember that they said that Europe is too complicated to agree quickly. They said we had too many obstacles. They said we were all talk, and they even started to question whether our heart was really in it. Today clearly showed that we mean business.
Countries that signed up have agreed to cut greenhouse gases and keep the rise in global temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. That's compared with pre-industrial levels.
In terms of feasibility, I think the 1.5 limit will be extremely difficult. And the main problem, I don't think, is going to be the matter of the availability of technology. I think the deeper issue is really the economic, social, and political complexity of essentially transforming not only the global economy, but to large measure the way people, particularly in developed countries, live, and the way developing countries may develop in the future. We know rather less about the social and political aspect of these things from an analytic point of view. We spend a lot of time trying to delve into future technologies, but the technologies probably will come along. It's how and if and whether we utilize them appropriately.
I think clearly it's going to be challenging to meet 1.5 or even 2 degree limit. It will require global transformations across all sectors of the economy. I think the feasibility has got to be judged against the other side as well. So if we don't meet the targets, what are the impacts? And we know that as temperatures rise, the impacts get worse and the damages increase. So I think it's, we have to do this and we have to cut emissions straight away.
We actually, from the scientific study and our regional modeling study, we found that it is, we are going to cross the way the emission is by 2025. And most likely, at most by 2030. But this is 10 to 15 years from now. We are crossing 1.5 degree, the way the world is going. But the question is, if we have adapted it very seriously, maybe we will reach there, but it's not a fixed level. We may come down to a more sustainable pre-industrial level even. So it is possible to attain that if we are able to work now, and this kind of conference here in Oxford is giving a very good scientific feedback as well as policy feedback to the policy makers and national leaders to come with the solutions how we can reach the Paris Agreement efforts to limit the emission to 1.5 degree centigrade from the pre-industrial period. So I think it is feasible, but it's a very important effort from all kinds of stakeholders like the scientists, natural scientists, the economists, and planners, policymakers to come together to put a great deal of effort to limit the emissions from now.
I think as we stand here today, and particularly in the context of this conference, it's quite clear that in terms of a business as usual pathway, it will not be feasible. But this is also the great challenge for the scientific community, policymakers, for every actor in our society. It is a transformation that we will literally have to engineer, we will have to catalyze, and we will have to have the support of not just leaders or captains in industry, but people. But I think looking forward, first of all, there is no alternative to trying to move towards a 1.5 degree target. And I think in the history of humanity, we've often seen the ability to reinvent ourselves. And I think this is one of those moments. So in principle, I remain convinced that that is an extremely challenging target, but I think no one at least has the evidence right now to say it is impossible.
Well, it's clearly very feasible. There's lots of ways you could do it. The issue, though, is that it's a colossal challenge in almost every sector of society. And hearing the talk today, I think the most important thing to get across is that it's an urgent challenge that people need to address now rather than debate whether or not it is feasible. We've got to go all out for it because so many people's lives depend upon it.
Well, it's geophysically feasible in that we are now at about 1 degree, so we've got half a degree to go, which means that we would have to reduce emissions by 20% for every 1/10 of a degree of warming on average from now on. Now, if you think about that, 1/10 of a degree at the moment is only taking about 7 or 8 years. So that immediately makes you think, okay, it's geophysically feasible, but how technically feasible, or even more so politically feasible it is, remains open to question. But one of the key messages of Paris was that the politicians don't want the scientific community to tell them what's politically feasible. They want to make the decisions. They want us just to explore what the implications are of the different options they have.
So, I mean, first of all, how necessary, how much do we need the 1.5 degree goal? And I work in the polar regions, and it's quite clear that many processes in the polar regions are very, very susceptible to just small temperature increase, and then those changes in the polar regions have a global impact as well. So whether we're talking about the impact of changes on the ice sheets in Greenland or in West Antarctica, we're already potentially seeing indications of some of the ice sheets, some of the key glaciers in West Antarctica potentially being in a reversible retreat just with the temperature rise that we're already seeing. So there's an indication, there are others as well, that even modest temperature rise is a cause of significant concern. How feasible is it to address the 1.5 degree challenge? I mean, that's really not my research area at all, but I do a lot of work with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, where we work with a broad range of different businesses. And the one thing that I've really gained insight from that is that there's huge amounts of sort of enthusiasm, creativity, people get inspired and want to innovate when they're set a challenge in the business community. I kind of have this sense that if the right challenge was set and enough people in the business community really inspired to get behind it, I kind of feel that whether we get enough action to get fast enough to get to 1.5, I don't know, but I do sense that a lot could be done on quite rapid timescales if people really focused in on it. And I think, as I say, I think there is that inherent enthusiasm, desire, creativity. You see repeated stories of companies I interact with whereby when they set these sort of ambitious goals for doing something on sustainability, they say that their whole workforce gets inspired to get behind it, and it comes with actually all sorts of interesting co-benefits internally just for the organisations themselves. So maybe there's some hope.
So I think the 1.5 degrees target is something that we should aim at. Whether we get there or not is partly that's partly academic. I think it's the fact that we are aiming for 1.5 degrees, which is the important thing. If we're breaking our back to get to 1.5 and we end up 1.8 or 2, that's better than aiming at 2 and ending up at 4 degrees Celsius.
From a carbon budget point of view, I think it's highly unlikely we'll be able to hold to 1.5 degrees centigrade. I am very sceptical of the negative emission technologies, particularly BECCS, the biomass energy carbon capture and storage. I do think we should research them. I think it's really important that we progress our understanding on these technologies, but I actually think we should assume they do not work when we develop emission scenarios. So I think it's very unlikely we'll hold to 1.5 degrees centigrade. To be honest, I think it's very unlikely we'll hold to a reasonable probability of 2 degrees centigrade now. And my concern with an event like this is we are prepared to rely on utopian technologies that do not yet exist, but we're not prepared to look at actual mitigation today, which sort of has profound challenging questions for the current economic paradigm. So until we are prepared to actually open up that Pandora's box, which will ask questions about how we live our lives today, I think we are unlikely to hold to even 2 degrees centigrade.
I think the question for feasibility is a real challenge. And the way the scoping meeting for the 1.5 degree special report was handled was not to address feasibility as such, because it also belongs to political will and acceptability, social acceptability, but conditions for feasibility. So options that are available to meet ambitious mitigation targets. So options available and implementation options that can shift from the idea of a trajectory to the realization of the transformation that is needed behind the trajectory. So I think the special report is not about feasibility, it's more about conditions for feasibility and opportunities, challenges and risks.
Well, I think the feasibility is of course not about the limit, the feasibility is about the pathway to achieve it. And then I think there are definitely technological options and there are definitely mitigation options out there that could have us stay within a carbon budget that is in line with 1.5. On the other hand, this very much depends on the political and societal momentum that will be generated over the coming 5 to 10 years. These are really critical. Otherwise, I think the limit is still valid and pertinent, but we have to count with an overshoot and exceeding the carbon budget in the near term or in the mid-term, and then we have to count with carbon dioxide removal in the long term in order to stay below this safe limit.
Look, 1.5 degrees is extremely challenging. I mean, we've had already 1 degree of warming. 1.5 degree would mean completely decarbonizing the economy in just a few decades. Do we have the knowledge? We do. Do we have the technology? In large part. Can we actually build the infrastructure and make the development, the political decision, the social transformations that are needed in just a few decades? I'm not sure. Still, we're in a good position. The global emissions have stalled in the past 2 years. Now we need to reverse the emissions. We need to decrease them, bring them down to zero. So it's not impossible, but it's a lot of work.
So in my presentation today, I focused on the physical climate science approach, and I stressed what we already know, especially from the IPCC AR5, but also where there are gaps. And there are gaps about implications of rates of changes, including overshoot. There are gaps sometimes for the most vulnerable areas, countries, people, especially small islands. So new research is being developed, but we need more progress to provide a quantitative approach for these specific situations. I also stressed the need for better knowledge for some aspects of the climate system, like the Arctic sea ice, the Antarctic sea ice, glaciers, threshold for Greenland ice sheet destabilization, that make a link between the need for more curiosity-driven research, process-based understanding, so that it better informs the implications for different warming targets on the policy side.
I think we can say a lot about the impacts directly related to temperature, so extreme hot days, hot nights, also cold nights and cold days where that is relevant. We can probably also say a lot about the shift of seasons, if you want, so when we expect the hot days and hot nights to occur, which I think might, on the impact side, even be more interesting than just the pure magnitude of that. We can say a lot about the increase in heavy precipitation, and I think there is also where we see a lot of difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. And I think Sonja said earlier that we don't know that much about storms yet, but I think that is an area where, especially with a lot of the attribution work and things that people like Gabe Becky at GFDL have been doing, we will probably be able to say more in the actual report in a year when we talk about impacts than we can today.
Well, in some gross technical sense, if it really meant 1.5 degrees global temperature rise and that's all, I think it's actually technically very feasible. So I work on these technologies for so-called solar geoengineering, the idea that we could make the Earth a little bit more reflective to cool down the planet and reduce climate risks. And there are lots of uncertainties about how we govern that technology, about how it reduces individual risks, but it's actually, I think, pretty certain that it would reduce temperature. So if truly the target just meant 1.5 C, then I think you can meet it with certainty if you have the ability to do solar geoengineering, which is something we pretty much have the ability to do. Now, obviously, there's been a kind of widespread commitment not to talk about that technology. So it's sort of really been pushed out of the IPCC conversation and mostly out of the conversation at this meeting for reasons that may or may not be good. I guess the second thing to say is that I don't really see the 1.5 degree target as a sort of strict quantitative target. I think it was an attempt for the negotiators to say, we really care about this issue, we care about it a lot. I don't think anybody involved at a really high level believes there's kind of a hard quantitative target that will be binding and kind of directly mean something. But I think it actually, I was very excited by the Paris result. I think it really does mean a step forward in the level of attention and ambition for people to cut emissions.
Well, I think the important thing to take into account here is the timescales at which you look, and we know already from the literature that the risk is quite different also for extreme events. So maybe while the mean difference between 1.5 and 2 is not so big, the risk one runs, for example, to have extreme events that are outside the historical experience is much higher. And then also the other timescale one needs to look at is, for example, those impacts that have a cumulative effect. For example, sea level rise. It's not just the moment we reach 1.5, but how long we sustain a higher warming level. And so I think there is good evidence that these impacts can be quite different. I think if we think about impacts of 1.5 and 2 degrees, one also needs to think about impacts of 1.5 and 2 degree pathways. For example, if we aim for 1.5, we still have a chance, maybe 10%, that we end up above 2 degrees or even more. If we aim for 2 degrees, we might still end up with a 10% chance to get to 3 degrees. So we also have to think about those impacts that are actually avoided by aiming for a 1.5 or a 2 degree pathway.